Sup guys, the 8th anniversary event is here, and in this video I'll be going over the new ships, retrofit, and fate simulations added in this update. I'll begin with the main dish, which is Belfast's UR retrofit. Comparing the retrofitted Belfast to the base version, both her damage and anti-air performance have essentially tripled, while her survivability received a lesser boost. She got an extra gun mount but lost a little bit of main gun efficiency as compensation, and then she also got quite a lot more firepower. If there is one unique thing about her, it's that her base firepower stat is significantly higher than all the other light cruisers now, similar to Essex's aviation stat post-retrofit from last year. She also received a second torpedo preload for some reason, but no other upgrades to her torpedoes otherwise. Her anti-air guns similarly received an entire extra mount, more anti-air stat, and 50% efficiency when including her new skill. She also received some additions to her second skill as well as a brand new third skill. Unfortunately, her smokescreen received no changes whatsoever, which is disappointing seeing as how it isn't 2017 anymore, and there are now plenty of ships with consistent smokescreen effects. Instead, the skill now has a conditional buff attached to it. If she's the sole light cruiser in the fleet, then she will increase the damage dealt by the main fleet by 6% for 50 seconds. Otherwise, she will gain 20% extra efficiency on her main gun, and all light cruisers will gain 20% anti-air. Her brand new third skill increases her anti-air efficiency, like I mentioned, and it also has a barrage attached to it, which will inflict a burn on a 20-second cooldown lasting 15 seconds. This barrage supposedly has the same pattern as Plymouth's 10-second barrage, which is quite staggered, so you can imagine that the barrage itself will take a couple of seconds to hit a target, during which the burn will be refreshed, and the uptime will be a little bit than 15 out of 20 seconds. Maybe closer to 16 to 17 seconds out of 20 seconds. More important than the damage of the burn itself though, is that this barrage makes her first skill's 16% damage boost more consistent without having to rely on someone else in the fleet to apply burns consistently. Unfortunately, 3 times of a low value can still be quite low, and the question is whether or not Belfast can carve herself a spot amongst the stiff competition that she suffers from the likes of San Diego, Takahashi, Bayard, and of course the god of light cruisers, Plymouth. Starting with damage, now that her skill 1's damage bonus against burning enemies can be considered almost permanent with the new barrage, she's getting a total of 40% damage on her guns and barrages, assuming you use an HE gun on her. Although the Plymouth gun is the best light cruiser gun overall, the gold French gun is essentially on par in terms of performance, without accounting for Belfast's buff, so there isn't much of a loss in having to use it. While she lacks a firepower buff like many other light cruisers, further exacerbated by the gun she has to use having 20 less firepower than the Plymouth gun, her significantly higher base firepower helps to compensate for that. Her main gun damage compares favorably against other light cruisers, but light cruiser guns are still the weakest among Vanguard guns, so not exactly something to be happy about. I had mentioned that her new skill's barrage has a similar pattern to Plymouth's, but the damage output is only half, and the cooldown is twice as long, meaning that it will only have about a quarter of the DPS, slightly higher since she fires it once at the beginning of battle. Her all-out assault received an upgrade, but it's quite minor and not enough to be considered a major part of her damage output. Overall, she's definitely the most gun-reliant light cruiser in terms of her damage output, so it's a bit difficult to directly compare her on paper to torpedo cruisers like Takahashi or Shimanto, or even barrage cruisers like San Diego and Bayard. Being a gun-reliant cruiser, she will suffer from the drawbacks that HE light cruiser guns have, such as having much lower damage against heavy armor and having a lot of her damage be stopped by hit shields, problems which many barrages and torpedoes bypass. Still, her damage should be solid, and I would be surprised if she dealt less damage than San Diego, for example, although I'm not quite sure whether she'll do more damage than Bayard or Takahashi just yet. Her anti-air stat is a bit easier to gauge. While she has 2 guns, her anti-air stat buffs aren't that high, so it's noticeably worse than the top-of-the-line anti-air ships like Sandy, Howden Liu, Guam, and so on, but still solid, around or just below that Z52 and Trafalgar level. Her survivability is still quite mediocre, having received slightly more HP and evasion, and that's pretty much it. Overall, her specific blend of damage and anti-air will likely earn her a spot even in some endgame fleets. For example, if you are looking for a ship with slightly more anti-air than Bayard or Plymouth and are okay with giving up some damage for it, but you don't need quite as much AA as San Diego. She's especially good in fleets with carriers compared to Plymouth, as her buff affects them unlike Plymouth's, and the extra anti-air will help them stay concealed. A ship like Takahashi will probably become her biggest obstacle to relevancy because there's a chance that she ends up dealing less damage than Takahashi while also having less anti-air. But I'm just going to assume that she would at least deal more damage against the light armor, seeing as how she is a HE specialist, while Takahashi is a torpedo ship. Okay, here is where I'm going to share some more personal thoughts about the augment. First, I'm glad that the UR Retrofit this year turned out to be a Belfast, as opposed to Prince Eugen, who some people said were going to be the Retrofit according to their source, Trust Me Bro. Belfast is an OG with a huge fanbase, and even from the very beginning when the overall power level of the ships were much lower, she's never really been at the forefront of the meta. In fact, I remember her being worse than Leander Retrofit, which was a common ship retrofitted into a rare. At long last, she's been given an opportunity to shine. However, I believe they were too conservative with some of these changes. The stat buffs and loadout changes were all perfectly fine, but in particular, the additions to her smokescreen skill leave a lot to be desired. I think the smokescreen should have just been guaranteed to proc every time. By today's standards, we have, for instance, a ship like Eldritch Retrofit from 2 years ago running around, who is sporting a more powerful defensive buff on top of the line anti-submarine and massive slow support. In comparison to this, making her smokescreen guaranteed is not overdoing it by any means. The 50-second restriction on her main fleet buff also doesn't quite make sense, as the number isn't that ridiculous. I think it should just be permanent. What's even worse is that she loses this buff if you sortie her with another light cruiser. These buffs should be cumulative as opposed to mutually exclusive. 20% increase to her main gun efficiency is nice, but not when it's at the cost of the main fleet buffs, and 20% extra AA is the last thing you need when you're running a light cruiser heavy fleet. If it were up to me, I would make the smokescreen guaranteed on every activation, then make the buffs cumulative, and if sortied with 3 light cruisers, then she also gives 20% firepower to allied light cruisers. Light cruisers are pretty weak anyway. You're giving 20% firepower to who, like Aurora? Or maybe Shimanto, who gets most of your damage from torpedoes. So it's not game breaking by any means. With the changes I'm proposing, she would probably become the best light cruiser in the game, and maybe even in contention for the best Vanguard in the game, but what exactly is wrong with that? It's not like balance is the only thing that matters, given the track record of ships like Eldritch's Retrofit and Max Immelmann. She's only the 3rd Rainbow Rarity light cruiser after San Diego and Plymouth from now 4 years ago, and a ship that never had a turn in the spotlight since the beginning, despite her popularity. While this retrofit is probably the biggest upgrade that a retrofit has awarded to a ship, up there with San Diego's, I still think she deserves more. At least I don't think there should be a conversation about whether she's better than other SSR light cruisers like Takahashi and Bayard. That would be more in line with an augment upgrade and not an SSR to UR retrofit. Is that too greedy of me? Let me know what you guys think. Okay, let's now move on to the new ships, starting off with Bennington. First of all, she's so hot that I don't even care about what she does, but I'll do my job. She's essentially the Eagle Union version of Formidable, having a ramping slow that turns into a root and then decays afterwards. Her barrage has HE rockets, and with her forced fighter slot, her damage is quite poor against heavy armor enemies. She seems a little bit weaker than Formidable though, as Formidable got quite a big damage upgrade from her unique augment. The fact that she requires at least 3 Eagle Union ships to do her job is honestly not super Eagle Union of her, since ships in this faction have typically been not too picky about their teammates. Something melting pot. At least her root is guaranteed, while Formidable still has a 20% chance to not proc hers past the first activation. Just like how Formidable has to compete with Implacable, Bennington also has to compete with the recently released Lexington II, who provides a 4-second root. Formidable actually deals more damage than Implacable in some situations though, but the same cannot be said about Bennington, who I don't think has anything going for her over Lexington II that I can see. So on one hand, I could just write her off as a ship that has no real use cases for a player like me, who has access to everything else, but I've had a bit of a shift in perspective recently after I created an account on the EN server. Bennington is a ship with a useful role, and New York players are obviously not going to have the luxury to use any ship that exists in the game, so if they do happen to pull Bennington, then she can serve as the setup character until they get somebody better later down the line. Similar to how there are healers other than Unicorn or random gold anti-air guns in every PR seasons that are never the greatest anti-air guns, but nevertheless serviceable, using Bennington or a healer that is in Unicorn or some random anti-air gun from whatever PR season you're currently working on as you progress will all come together to create an experience unique to each individual player while not being detrimental to the point where it's impossible to progress. In that sense, I think that Bennington is a perfectly fine SSR ship, but yeah, whether you should actually roll this banner or save for a UR one depends on how many cubes you have saved up, and I can't answer that question for everyone. Next up is Colette. She's just a stat stick pretty much. She's got decent anti-air and anti-submarine, decent damage from her barrages, she's decently cute, pretty much a well-rounded jack of trades but master of none. The last SSR ship is Vicksburg. She has a lot of AA stats, but her efficiency is really low for this type of ship, which is actually typical of the Cleveland class in a bad way. As a result, her AA is mediocre despite all the buffs, and her barrage numbers aren't that high either, so nothing really stands out about her either. The SR ships are just your average SRs gameplay-wise. Let's move on then to the PR8 Fate simulations. Vittorio Coniberti, who I already considered the best out of the three, seems to also have received the best upgrade. Her barrages tied to her smokescreen was already the best part of her kit, has been further upgraded, so she just does even more damage now. Still mostly a medium armor specialist though. Next is Dmitry Donskoy. Her crit buff increased by 10% crit rate and crit damage, and her main gun efficiency buff went up by 5%, bringing her main guns from 140% to 145%. Pretty much a nothing burger. The AP only armor break debuff is now tied to the highest FP having main fleet ship instead of a random main fleet ship, but it's still too weak and doesn't last long enough to really matter. Yeah, I don't know. She's not that great, and I think Bayard, who was already really strong to begin with, got more from her fate simulation than Donskoy did. The last ship is Kansas. It seems like she got some damage buffs slapped on, which doesn't really address the issue of her ramping buffs requiring her to use a very slow gun to make full use of, which either results in using a terrible gun or not getting the enhanced barrage. I think it's still better to just use a normal gun, since she got main gun efficiency from her fate sim, so you should probably forego the enhanced barrage in favor of more main gun damage. Okay, the last thing is this auxiliary equipment from the event store. It only does something when equipped on Colette, and it only roots one time at 13 seconds into the battle. There's probably some application of this for getting high scores in EX mode, but that's none of my concern. On the other hand, the SX exclusive auxiliary we got from the pre-event here is actually pretty good on SX. Trading 53 points of aviation if you were using a steam catapult for 30 points in accuracy, which I do think is worth it in a lot of situations, but not a significant upgrade for SX. And with that, all of the new content should have been covered. I'll be releasing more content in celebration of the anniversary coming soon, so look forward to that. Thanks for watching, happy anniversary, and see you in the next one.